What does success look like in a COVID-19 world? It doesn't just look like having a low number of cases. That's welcome. But if we were to consider our success on COVID-19 as just having a low number of cases, that's not good enough. And that's not what our government is seeking to achieve, and I don't believe it's what the National Cabinet is seeking to achieve either. We have had great success in flattening our curve, that's obvious. But having a low number of cases, but having Australians out of work, having a low number of cases and children not receiving in-classroom education, having a low number of cases and businesses not being open, having a low number of cases and Australians not able to be going about their as normal of lives as possible. That's not what success looks like. This is the success we're seeking, to be able to have the protections in place to enable Australians to go back to as normal a life and an economy as possible, and to be able to achieve that as soon as we possibly can. And so it's important that we remain focused on the challenge ahead. We don't want to just win the battle against COVID-19, but lose a broader conflict when it comes to our economy and the functioning of our society. That's why we remain focused on the road ahead, the road back, the restoration of key elements of our economy, and to ensure that the broader health needs of Australians are also being addressed. Christine Morgan is joining me here today and will provide you with a presentation on issues relating to mental health as we go through the COVID-19 crisis. As you know, this was a matter that we raised very early in the piece and provided additional support, and I particularly commend also the state and territory governments for the way they've responded to the mental health challenges here. But it is important to understand that there are so many elements of Australians' health that we need to continue to attend to. Looking after our COVID-19 health is only one of many parts of our health. Our mental wellbeing, ensuring that our screenings continue to take place for the very many different diseases and other things that we need to continue to screen for, that individuals, Australians, families stay in contact with their GPs to address their broader health issues. Elective surgery has recommenced for that very purpose as well, for the many important surgeries that need to take place for Australians who have been suffering because of the restrictions that had previously been in place. And so we are looking at what the bigger picture success is when it comes to COVID-19. And we are working to all of that together as a national cabinet. Our own cabinet here at a Commonwealth level will be meeting again today, as we do every week, to ensure we're focused on all elements of the recovery and the road back. And it's important to understand that on the road back, when we get to that COVID-safe environment where we can ease those restrictions, which is not too far away, and you're already seeing that happen with many of the states and territories, as I said they would over this interim period before we get together in the week beginning the 11th of May and consider the baseline restrictions. States are already moving back from where they were ahead of those baselines, and you've seen those announcements, whether it's in New South Wales or Western Australia or other places, and that's welcome, and I think that demonstrates to Australians that there is a dividend for them for the way that they have been conducting themselves. Sure, there's been some rather high-profile examples of those who haven't done that, and I think Australians have expressed their views on that pretty candidly. But in the main, I think Australians have been doing the right thing, and that's why they are seeing some easing of those restrictions. But when we move back into this more COVID-safe economy and society, it's important to know that with the easing of those restrictions, of course there will continue to be additional cases. Of course there will be outbreaks. That's what living with the virus will be like. That's why the protections that we put in place for a COVID-safe Australia are so important. Now, I can report that 2.8 million downloads and registrations have taken place already for the app, and I thank those 2.8 million Australians for doing just that. And I'd ask for millions and millions and millions more to do the same thing. This is an important protection for a COVID-safe Australia. I would liken it to the fact that if you want to go outside, when the sun's shining, you've got to put sunscreen on. This is the same thing. Australians want to return to community sport, if you want to return to a more liberated economy and society, it's important that we get increased numbers of downloads when it comes to the COVIDSafe app. This is the ticket to ensuring that we can have eased restrictions and Australians can go back to the lifestyle and the many things that they previously were able to do. And this is important. So if you've downloaded the app, thank you very much. Convince 2 or 3 more people that haven't downloaded the app to do the same thing. Now, we are unable to give you breakdowns of what ages of people have downloaded the app or what states they're from, because all of that information is locked in the National Data Store. And as you know, that is not information that is available to the Commonwealth Government or the state governments. That is the protection we have put in place. So we would encourage all Australians, if you want to see us return to the more eased restrictions that I know you're looking forward to and that I'm looking forward to, that it is important that you download the COVIDSafe app. That is your ticket. That is Australia's ticket to a COVIDSafe Australia, where we can go about the things that we love doing once again. I can also note that more than 800,000 job seeker claims have now been processed. That number will be well in advance of that by the end of today. It was just over 790,000 last night. And also earlier this week, the $550 job seeker supplement is now being paid, and that's rolling out over the course of this week. I can also note that the government has been working closely with the aged care sector and aged care consumer groups, including the Council on the Ageing, towards developing an industry code of conduct for supporting visitations to aged care facilities. You'll be aware of the strong views that the National Cabinet and I have expressed in ensuring that residents of aged care facilities are not shut away, and that they do have access to their loved ones and their carers and others who provide support to them. There are, of course, legitimate reasons why there would be restrictions at aged care facilities, particularly and obviously in places where there have been outbreaks. That's sensible, that's safe, that's to be expected. But the norm should be, as the National Cabinet has set out in the health advice that they adopted some weeks ago now, and it is the intention for that to be incorporated into an industry code of conduct, and we're making good progress on that, and I would hope that we'd be in a position to have that finalised hopefully by the end of the week. But I thank the aged care sector for their cooperation and their engagement in pursuing that together with the Aged Care Minister Richard Colbeck, and I thank them and all the aged care workers all across the country for the work that they are doing, caring for our most vulnerable Australians. And we need to ensure that we keep them safe, but we keep them connected, because that's good for their health as well. Now, just finally, before I hand over to Christine to talk more specifically about the mental health challenges that we have and the progress we're making and the progress we need to make, I note that there was a $74 million package that was put in place at the early stages of the COVID-19 outbreak, and that package of support has been rolling out across the country and has been getting very good results. 50% of mental health consultations are now being done through telehealth as a result of the telehealth changes that we have made, and 1 million telehealth mental health consultations have taken place since mid-March, and some $35 million specifically in mental health related consultations have been conducted over that period of time since telehealth was put in place. So this is an important service that is available to Australians. It is clear, and I'll ask Christine to go through this, but the isolation, the stay at home has been important, but it does come with an increase in anxiety and an increase in pressure on individuals, their mental stress, and that also takes a toll. And that's why it is important that we get these COVID-safe arrangements in place so people won't be constrained as they have been. They won't be under as much anxiety as they have been as a result of the isolation restrictions that have been necessary. It does impact on people's mental health, and that's why the telehealth facilities are so important. And for Australians who are feeling that way, for Australians who feel under stress, that is entirely normal and it is to be expected. And there are a vast array of services that are available to you to support you at this time. And Christine will go through those, but they're well known. There's Lifeline Australia, Kids Helpline, Beyondblue, Suicide Callback Service, Men's Line Australia, Headspace, all of these services and many more, available online, available on phone, but also particularly through your GP and the ability for you to engage in those consultations. Psychologists, psychiatrists also can provide telehealth consultations. They're there to help you through this very stressful period. And it only underscores again why it is so important that we get Australia back to a position where it can be COVID safe across the country, which means we can release the pressure. We can release some of the stress that's on families and individuals across the country from isolation and ensure they can get back to work, get back to school, get back to normal, get back to sport. And if you want to see that happen, I want to see that happen, download the COVIDSafe app, please. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Prime Minister. So as the Prime Minister has said, it was on the 29th of March that the government announced a mental health support package, anticipating ahead, I think, of the curve of most countries, the mental health impact that would be an inevitable consequence for many, many Australians. And to recall that package said, firstly, we must actually understand that the significance and the magnitude of the changes that we're being called upon to make as Australians to respond and protect our safety, our physical safety and the safety of our country, will have an impact on us. We are being required to live differently. We're being required to live in different circumstances, quite constrained circumstances. So we established a specific support line hosted by Beyondblue, and I'll take you through in a moment just what we're seeing with some stats with respect to Beyondblue. You may also remember that we said we actually have to take a preventative approach. We have to identify those particular groups in Australia who may be more vulnerable, and we need to try and make sure that we are putting in place supports for them. In that space, we did some support services for our older Australians, for our younger Australians who were particularly challenged with the breaks in their education, our Indigenous Australians, our emergency frontline workers. And we have seen, as we anticipated, that there has been an increase in services. We also, at that time, most importantly, as the Prime Minister has said, we made a shift which really was a 10-year shift done in 10 days, and I can't overestimate that, of moving our mental health services onto a telehealth platform in recognition that people could not get to them. So what has actually been happening? So I've chosen here just 3 snapshots of services that are being provided in the digital online space, but they're indicative of the broader range of services we have. Beyondblue has seen a 40% increase in contacts being made to it over this time last year. And what we're seeing with respect to those calls is an increase in the distress levels, an increase in the anxiety levels, in the complexity of what people are feeling. We're also hearing, and this is an anecdotal, but I think we're hearing in something I will note later, that people are perhaps not feeling as safe as they once did. So I think that is of concern. We look at our Head to Health. Now, Head to Health was one of the initiatives that we boosted back at the end of March because we said it is incredibly important that we have a single source of truth where people can go to know the facts around this, what they need to do for their mental health and where can they go. You can see the enormous spike in visits to Head to Health. And our young people with Reach Out. And I'm really pleased to see and to be able to affirm what Reach Out has just done in this last week in launching a specific online support package for parents and young people as they transition back into school. We know that for our young people, they are incredibly concerned, not just about their education and the drop in education and the linkages there, not just about the fact they're not necessarily seeing and getting the supports that they did in a school environment, but our young people are concerned about the future. They understand the economic impacts of what we must go through for this, and they are understandably worried. So from a mental health perspective, it is incredibly important that we're actually there to support them. And again, we see that usage. But there are a couple of interesting things that are happening, and I want to just pause there and say what we're really looking at the moment is this current phase. And the current phase, and you'll hear me say this frequently, I do not use the word social distancing. I have an anathema to it. I use the word physical distancing with social connection, because it is about being physically distant, but how incredibly important it is to stay connected. And that has manifested itself in what we have heard over the last month. People are finding it challenging living in confined spaces. The most confined would be quarantine or required isolation, but for those of us staying at home, and that's the majority, the vast, vast majority of Australians, it is a pressure cooker. We're living with our loved ones. That doesn't mean it's easy. So they're the issues we need to deal with. Another issue that has really emerged has been a sense of loneliness for many Australians. For those Australians who live on their own, who actually cannot have that tangible reality of a hug from a loved one, we cannot underestimate the mental health impact that is having on our Australians. And of course, there is the worry that is being addressed, but it is a worry about the job security, housing security, employment security, those issues. So what we would have hoped to have seen as a response to that is actually an increase in use of mental health services. The reality is that overall, there has actually been a decrease. Now, why is that happening? Why we think that is happening is that for those who would normally be using mental health services to support their mental health and well-being or their mental health challenges are not actually going out and doing those visits. Now, we partially addressed that with the pivot to telehealth, and it's incredibly important that we look at the increased use. If I can show you on this graph, the increased percentage use of psychologists using telehealth. It is now over the 50% mark. It is working. But what we do, and I do this as a call out to all Australians, we did come into this scenario, we did come into COVID-19 with mental health challenges, many of us. We did come in with mental illness. You do still need to contact your mental health services. You can do it now through telehealth, you can do it through the digital services, but part of getting through this whole crisis is that we actually address our mental health and our well-being. So reach out. We will continue to do that. I think that's probably the most that I would want to say on that. The other thing we are noticing, just to support that last comment of a slight decrease, is generally our presentations to our emergency departments are down as well. So as I say, a call out to all Australians, your mental health is really important, your mental well-being is important. As I've said before, it's actually foundational. It's foundational to our creative resilience and being able to get through this in the best way we can. But also just some circumstantial things that we're hearing, which I think it's just important to put to our notice. If I can just go, thank you. I mentioned that in particular in talking to my colleague Georgie Harman at Beyondblue, that they are hearing stories of people not feeling safe. And I think this is a reality that all Australians need to address. I've said before that it is incredibly difficult to go behind closed doors to see what is happening in confined spaces. But we can look at the increasing calls to 1800 Respect. We can look at the increased calls, not there, but which we have also recorded, to Men's Helpline. We know that this is happening. We know that people may be more challenged than normal to reach out for help. So I call on all Australians, keep your eyes alert for what may be needed. So what are we doing? In conversations this morning with the Prime Minister and with our Federal Health Minister, and reflecting on a very, very strong meeting that we had with Australian ministers responsible for mental health just at the end of last week, we are looking at significantly ramping up our ability to coordinate service delivery, to ensure that the accessibility that we've opened up with telehealth, the accessibility we've opened up with increased digital and online services, is able to be accessed by Australians in a way that passes across our jurisdictional and Commonwealth systems. We need to make that work better. We need to ensure that anybody who actually needs a service is reached. We're looking at how can we reach those Australians who are not currently coming to us for help. We know when we look at those we lose to suicide, that 50% of those we lose have not come in touch with our mental health services. We are looking to what we can do by way of outreach. So the Commonwealth is working in conjunction with the states and the territories on a plan, on a mental health response plan, which will look at what are we doing in the current scenario, what are the current specific issues, challenges and services we need, when we're in this state of physical distancing and staying at home. Then we will look at what is the appropriate response as we ease those restrictions, and we must ease those restrictions. Now, as the Prime Minister has said, that is absolutely critical to us getting back to the life we all want to have. Will we be anxious during that time? Yes, that's inevitable. We can't stop the anxiety, but we can certainly support and address it. So the second phase that we will be looking at the reality of that, and how can we, from a mental health perspective, ensure that we're there to meet the needs of Australians. We will look at what are the particular issues, should there be surges or hotspots, and we will look at what is needed for longer term recovery. And that is a plan which I understand from the Prime Minister he's invited to be put before National Cabinet. And we are doing this in a very short turnaround time. We will have something to present for consideration by the end of next week.
Thank you, Christine. As Head of the Mental Health Commission, on the day National Cabinet was actually formed, there were 3 presentations that were made to the group that day. The Governor of the Reserve Bank, Head of Treasury, and Christine Morgan was also there on that day out in Parramatta, and so it'll be important. Christine will be making a presentation to the National Cabinet this Friday, and then following that up with the plan that is already underway, working with the states and territories. The cooperation on mental health between the states and territories and the Commonwealth has been outstanding. Happy to take questions. Why don't we start with you, Greg, at the back, and then just work our way around the room, if you'd like.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Just on this, data, I guess, is key to everything at the moment. You're talking, Christine, about trying to identify hotspots for surges. Just wondering if there are correlations between job keeper and job seeker, that is unemployment circumstances, that whether that data might be helpful in you identifying pressure points geographically or in the community.
Thank you. If I could just perhaps clarify, when I talk about hotspots, that's not necessarily hotspots for mental health issues. It's hotspots for presentation of the illness and what that may mean, particularly if you need to go into more restrictive lockdown type scenarios. That said, I don't think it is an easy thing to do any correlation between particular stresses, and we do certainly acknowledge the significance of the economic and employment stresses, and help seeking for mental health. Particularly at a time when we are opening it up to telehealth and when we're opening it up to digital and online. We can certainly look at engagement rates, we can certainly look at those who are reaching out, and we can try and pick up some trend data. As I said to the Prime Minister this morning, one of the challenges, of course, with mental health data is that it is not as quantitative or as finite as what has been able to be used in terms of tracking physical reactions to COVID-19. So we're very much looking at trend lines. We're looking at keeping all of our senses open to understand the reality of what's happening.
Yeah, we'll just get moving across the back and then we'll make that.
Prime Minister, you today again indicated that you'd like to see states begin to lift restrictions back maybe potentially to where the baseline that was agreed by National Cabinet. All the states have begun to do that on some level, other than Victoria, who's standing strong on keeping all restrictions in place until May 11 at the very earliest. Have you had a discussion with Premier Daniel Andrews about this at all, and what's come of that? And if I may, also on the schools issue, if independent schools in Victoria take up this funding proposal put forward by the government last night, that potentially would see those students come back about 6 weeks earlier than the public school students.
Yeah.
What would be the issue you would see there, and what would you like to see done in Victoria on schools?
Well, first of all, Dan and I, Premier and I, talk quite regularly, as you'd expect, as I do with all the premiers. We're working together. That doesn't mean we don't, from time to time, have a different view about particular issues. It'd be extraordinary if we didn't. But the fact is that when we do work through these issues, we do it in a very cooperative and respectful way. And that's very much the relationship I have with not only Dan, but all the premiers and chief ministers as we've worked through these issues. And so, look, yes, we talk all the time about this. And the point about states that have gone beyond the baseline levels of restrictions is that is entirely a matter for those states, and for them to make that judgment based on how they see the conditions in their own state. Now, the case numbers in Victoria and New South Wales, for that matter, and you could also argue Queensland to a slightly lesser extent, is very different to the circumstances in Western Australia, South Australia, the Northern Territory in particular. And so it is not surprising that you would see those states with incredibly low case numbers and track records on those issues to be moving running ahead of the states on the East Coast. I'd been flagging that for months, that I would expect that to be the case. And indeed, the experience of those other states in Western Australia and South Australia, I think, will provide a good guide to those states like New South Wales and Victoria, which have had a much higher incidence of the virus in their communities. So I think that their experience actually helps each other. And we are all swapping notes, and our officials are all swapping notes on how this is working, and I expect that to continue in the weeks ahead before that key date, which the National Cabinet has flagged. Now, in relation to schools, this is a position we've adopted nationally. It's something I flagged with the Premiers back in mid-April. It is true that states run the state school systems and they'll make calls in their states, and the Commonwealth is the predominant funder of independent and Catholic schools, and will make decisions based on the evidence, and that evidence both on a health basis and as well as from educationalists, as you've seen, is that classroom teaching is where we need to get to, and that's what we'll be supporting independent and Catholic schools to do. That is a national policy, and it's one that we're pursuing nationally, and it's one that we've already had very positive response to, and we'll continue to go down that path for those schools. And in terms of any different practices at state schools by states, well, I'm sure that will be not proved to be too much of a hurdle for people to get over. Yeah.
In regards to the road ahead, some researchers from a group of 8 universities have argued that pursuing elimination through continued strict lockdowns could lead to greater community confidence, which would flow on to greater participation in the economy and deliver ultimately a far higher, in their words, economic outcome, a quicker economic recovery. Has that factored into your thinking from an economic point of view and from a mental health point of view?
Well, to be fair, they put two views, and which sort of argue both sides of the argument. So that's not surprising in what we're dealing with. There are a lot of uncertainties in this area, but our government has pursued that suppression approach. We haven't gone to the eradication approach. The eradication approach, which whether you characterise the New Zealand approach as that or not, I know there's some debate about that. But they obviously went into much more extreme economic measures and basically getting the same health results as Australia, and some would argue Australia has had stronger results. The idea is pretty simple, and that is to get the virus under control. And I think by any measure, Australia, compared to other nations, has done extraordinarily well on that front. But then you have to put in place, as we're doing right now, the protections for a COVID-safe Australia. And those protections are the key to that economic unlocking into the future. Because otherwise, you simply, as I think the New South Wales Premier was suggesting this morning, and as I've warned against as well, you get into this stop-go approach going forward, and you don't want that. What you want is a confident moving forward and continuing to make gains, and then continuing to ease restrictions and continuing to be in a position where your economic activity is lifted. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be setbacks, and it doesn't mean there won't be outbreaks, and it doesn't mean there won't be extra cases. I suspect there will. The question is more about what you can do about those outbreaks. Now, if you go back over a month ago, there was no concept of, I'll use Christine's term, physical distancing and with social connection. There was no concept of that in the community. There was no app to protect. There was not widespread testing. There had not been the ramp up in our ICU capability at that time. All of those things were not in place 6 weeks ago. They are now, not more or less. There's still work to do on the app. Download the app, COVIDSafe, please, and get about that task, because that will enable us to go further down this path. But so that is how we're pursuing it, putting the protections in place for a COVID-safe Australia, which means we can get an economic growth occurring again, and for Australians to move back to all the things they like doing again. It won't be exactly like it was before. I can't see international travel occurring anytime soon. Can't see that. The risks there are obvious. The only exception to that, as I've flagged, is potentially with New Zealand. And we've had some good discussions about that. But outside of that, that's unlikely. But I look forward to the time when Australians can travel again within Australia. I look forward to the time where they can sit down to a meal at a restaurant or a cafe or in a pub again. I look forward to the time where they can see whether it's the AFL, the netball or the NRL or whatever code it is they support, and being able to watch that again. But I can't see them going along to the game for a while, those larger mass gatherings. I can see, I suppose, the opportunity for those seeking private prayer in a place of worship. I can see that happening. I can't necessarily, though, see large services occurring again. But anyway, these are the issues we have to work through. Yeah, Brett?
Just on the virus more broadly, is Australia still going to push for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 in Geneva at the World Health Assembly? And just on the reaction from China, it's getting very messy. Some comments today in Chinese media about this being an all-out crusade, accusing you and your government of panda bashing. Is this a fight you need right now?
Well, Australia will continue to, of course, pursue what is a very reasonable and sensible course of action. This is a virus that has taken more than 200,000 lives across the world. It has shut down the global economy. The implications and impacts of this are extraordinary. Now, it would seem entirely reasonable and sensible that the world would want to have an independent assessment of how this all occurred so we can learn the lessons and prevent it from happening again. I don't think this is a remarkable suggestion. I think it's a fairly obvious and common sense suggestion that I believe there will be support for at the right time to ensure we do that. We're a supporter and a funder of the World Health Organisation. We have supported particularly the work they do on the ground here in our region, in Southeast Asia and in the Southwest Pacific. But it's an organisation like any that can learn lessons from how this began and the authorities they had to understand what was happening and the transparency around those issues. Nothing extraordinary about that. So what Australia is pursuing is not targeted. It is said independently. It is said out of common sense, and I think in Australia's national interest and in the global interest. And so I find Australia's position to be not remarkable at all, but one that is entirely responsible, and I'm sure is broadly seen in that light around the world.
So in terms of China's response, though, I mean, they don't see these as ordinary comments. They're angry about these comments.
No, that's for them. Australia will do what's in our interest and in the global interest, and we will, of course, continue to support moves to ensure there's a proper independent assessment of what's occurred here. I mean, that's in the global health interest, it's in the global economic interest. It's not a remarkable position. It's a fairly common sense position and one that we don't result from. Greg?
Cromwell, you've outlined your concern about your opposition about the reopening of wet markets in parts of China. What about, there are many, as we've seen today, wet markets in Indonesia as well. Are you similarly concerned about health issues that could arise from those wet markets? And will you be asking the World Health Organisation to look into that? And just secondly, you've just looked into the camera and asked Australians to download the app, please. Yep. Have you had that same conversation with Barnaby Joyce?
I haven't had the chance to talk to Barnaby, to be honest. I've been a little busy. But he's been part of the Backbench committee meetings and Backbench and party room meeting gatherings that we've had, and there's been the opportunity to raise those issues in the normal forum, and I've spoken to all of those forums as well. But it highlights the point that, this is not a mandatory exercise. We are seeking the goodwill and support and participations of Australians to deal with a national health crisis. And the appeal is simply made on that basis. And as I said, downloading the app is like putting on sunscreen to go out into the sun. It gives us protection as a nation. It protects you, it protects your family, it protects your loved ones, it protects our health workers, and it protects your job and the jobs of many others, because it enables us to move forward and to get the economy back on the track we want it to be on. The protections are in place in terms of people's privacy and the other legal protections. The Biosecurity Act provisions are already in place, and we'll have belts and braces when it comes to the legislation that comes before Parliament. Look, on wildlife wet markets, my position has never been directed only to one country. It's been a broad position. These markets exist in many places, just as the next pandemic could come from any country in the world. It could occur in any part of the globe, and it's important that we learn the lessons of how this pandemic started so we could move on any future pandemic wherever it starts. This is why it's an important initiative, and one that I believed has support for it to occur at the right time. In Europe at the moment, I was speaking to the President of the European Commission last night. We discussed this issue. The Europeans are bringing forward a motion on this matter at the World Health Assembly. I think it's a very good motion.
Prime Minister, Newmarch House, could I ask for your response to the events of the last 36 hours there, and beyond the visitor code of conduct that you've already spoken about, does it suggest to you that we are failing in our management of aged care in this pandemic in this country, and how might your government address those failings?
Well, Tim, first of all, my first thoughts were the families of the 12 residents who have passed away. Australians who have passed away during the COVID crisis, while those numbers are nowhere near as high as we've seen in many other countries, they are still very real here in Australia, and particularly for the families of those who've lost loved ones. And it is one of the sad truths of the COVID-19 virus that it particularly is fatal towards those who are vulnerable because of whether their age or comorbidities or other health challenges that they may have. And that's why aged care facilities have been a key area of focus for us. And we have had a number of outbreaks in a number of facilities, that is true. But by and large, across the country, when you think of the number of people who are in aged care facilities and the number of facilities that are affected, the performance to date at a national level, right across all states and territories, well, I think the numbers speak for themselves. It doesn't lessen the impact of those who we've lost in the facilities that are there. Not for 1 second, and I understand the frustration of families, particularly when it relates to communications around these issues. And in relation to communication, a webinar was held last week with the families, the Service, New South Wales Health and the Federal Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. At our request, the Older Persons Advocacy Network held a meeting with families last night towards improving communication between residents and their families, and of course the government has also today asked OPAN, which is that Older Persons Advocacy Network, to put a worker on site to assist families with up-to-minute information on their loved ones. So yeah, communication is key, but I suspect and know that one of the great frustrations for families is being able to have access to the facility, and there is limited access to that facility at Newmarch. But that is an obvious case of where there has been an outbreak, that obviously there are going to have to be restrictions on people's access in that situation. And where there are outbreaks in other facilities, as we've seen in parts of Tasmania or in New South Wales or other places, being able to move as quickly as you can to separate those who have the virus, and in almost all cases, to the best of my knowledge, the virus has come in through a workforce, not through visitors. And that's unfortunate, but that's why our testing regime is moving to address particularly those in a lot of these vulnerable work areas, both for their protection but particularly for the protection of residents. So the aged care task here, I think, is very difficult and very challenging. But to date, despite some outbreaks in particular facilities, then the mainstream of aged care experience here has been much better than those. And there is a combination of responsibilities. Of course, the Commonwealth funds these facilities. We run the quality oversight in relation to these facilities and those things. The State Health Department has the public health response in that facility, and they do their job. We do our job. The aged care sector itself does its job. So everyone has responsibilities here, and we're all exercising them and working together.
As we look to coming out of this crisis, a lot of the debate is turning to our high level of dependency on China. Do you think that in future we should become less dependent, for example, in the university sector, Chinese students, and in terms of manufacturing, should we be more self-sufficient in certain products rather than having to have this dependence on imports from China in certain sectors?
I think Australia should always act in its national interest. I think Australia should always seek to be having an economy that is self-sufficient as possible, and to be that, it has to be competitive. There are things that have restrained the competitiveness of our manufacturing and other sectors in Australia, that if we want to have these sovereign capabilities, it isn't achieved through nationalisation or large public subsidies and protectionism. It's achieved by having competitive businesses that can operate in these sectors and be successful. That's what the road back looks like. It doesn't look like, an industry run from Canberra. It looks like an industry made up of very successful, innovating businesses on the ground, finding markets, sustaining themselves, employing many Australians, engaging new technology and using the best minds that we have. That's where sovereignty comes from, and that's the type of approach that we'll be pursuing. Australians will find markets, as we have been for a long time, all around the world. And for many years now, our markets have been diversifying. I mean, the predominance of our trading relationship with China is obviously resources-based, and I see no reason why that would alter in the future. I mean, the thing about our relationship with China is it's a mutually beneficial one. It's a comprehensive strategic partnership, and we will continue to pursue that partnership, respecting China's sovereignty and their independence, and its success will continue to depend on that being returned.
And the universities?
Well, again, the universities find themselves in a challenging situation at the moment, and they've received a lot of support from the government in this present crisis. But they will look to their future. They will make decisions about their commercial arrangements and the markets that they will seek to focus on. It's not for the government to make those decisions for them. They'll make those decisions themselves, and they'll make them in the best interest in the future viability of their own operations.
Jacinda Ardern took a phone call from the Queen last night. Have you spoken to Her Majesty? And I mean, on China again, there's state-backed media that's got a lot of rhetoric about Australia being a bully in the region and bits and pieces like this. Are you concerned state-backed media having comments about Australia being a bully in the region?
State-backed media?
Like Chinese
Right,
state-backed
okay.
media, being a bully in the region and so on. Is there concern that the wheels have really fallen off this relationship, that beyond COVID it's going to have remaining tensions in the Australian-China relationship?
No, I don't think so. Look, Australia, we hold a consistent position, and we have on a range of issues. There's not going to be agreement on all of those issues all the time, and I think the key to Australia's relationship is just being consistent. And we're consistent on all of the measures of where there's been some potential tension and frustration. As there has been on these, we will just be consistent. We don't lightly form the views that we do on these things. And we hold the position that we have. We seek to explain it as best we can, as respectfully as we can, and understand that the comprehensive strategic partnership is built on that mutual benefit. And I think that mutual benefit continues to be there now and into the future. But both countries will manage that relationship from the perspective of its own national interest. That is not extraordinary. That is what you'd expect, and I can assure you, we will manage every relationship that we have in our national interest. We will put Australia first in all of these arrangements, wherever it may be. And no, I haven't heard from the Queen. I have heard from Prince Charles, though, and I'm happy to take the call. Jenny and I had the great privilege of meeting Her Majesty last year, and I'm pleased that she's in great health. And I hope she recently enjoyed her birthday, and we celebrated that ourselves.
PM, the NRL aims to be back on May 28. Will that happen?
Well, that still hasn't been determined. The Commonwealth has made no decision about the access by the Warriors into Australia. That hasn't happened. I think it's helpful for all of these issues that have to be resolved to hopefully achieve that timetable, that they be done between agencies and the NRL, and indeed with the AFL and the other supporting codes who are working to these ends, and we'll continue to work with them in good faith. And I think the best way for those things to be resolved and progressed is in that normal way. But there's still a bit of work to do. But as I said at the outset, I like the aspiration. It'd be great to see it back on there, but it's got to satisfy all the health requirements, and there is the code that is being developed for elite sport, professional sport, community sport, as well as individual recreation. That's being done by the medical expert panel now. I received an update on that this morning from Professor Murphy, and we hope to make more progress on that for that to be able to be available for a first look by the National Cabinet later this week. But I stress again, if we want to get back to sport, then we need to download the app. It's not a mandatory requirement, but it's common sense. And if Australians want to see that happen, then when we sit down as a national cabinet and make these decisions about easing restrictions, it's one of the many things we're going to be looking at. I'd love to see community sport get back. The evidence we're seeing about transmission in outdoor areas is encouraging. The medical evidence on that is encouraging. But for us to have confidence of a COVIDSafe Australia, then we need the COVIDSafe app to be in place. Kieran.
PM, a 4-year-old that got COVID and went to daycare for 2 days at a daycare centre in near Penrith in Sydney. Obviously, health officials will be looking at that very closely to see whether any kids or teachers contracted the virus. It's a reminder. I'm asking you, how do you react to that? I guess it's a reminder that young kids are still vulnerable to it, although less vulnerable than other elements of the population. And Ms Morgan, I want to ask you, have you got any advice to people who might be having experience with mental health issues for the first time? Maybe not wanting to get assistance, but things like, exercise, simple tips you can give people.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, look, on the first one, and Professor Murphy, I think, is better placed to comment on the epidemiology of these. It has always been the case that there are cases amongst those who are younger, but proportional to the rest of the population, a very small incidence, and also the incidence of those who are of younger age contracting the coronavirus as compared to a normal respiratory ailment, a flu or something like that, is much, much, much lower. So undoubtedly there will be individual cases. That's, I don't think of itself a surprise, but it really goes to any sort of more widespread incidents. But I have no doubt that those individual cases are looked at by Professor Murphy and the rest of the medical expert panel.
Thank you. And thank you for your question. So what, if I understand it correctly, it's for those of us Australians who are feeling a stress on our mental health and our mental well-being. We may not feel at this point in time we need the formal counselling support, but what can we do? And it's a great question, because I think that just like with our physical health, there are very practical things we can do to look after our physical health. Likewise with our mental health, and it is being challenged. So you heard me say at the beginning, physical distancing with social connectedness. I think that social connectedness is probably the most fundamental thing. And social connectedness is not communicating. It's not just doing the texting and the typing. It is actually engaging on as human an interaction level as you can with other people within the confines of your own home or wherever you may be. So it's using FaceTime, it's Skyping, it's hearing a laugh is better than being told about a laugh. So it's actually that human connection. And I can't emphasise that enough, whether we're dealing with people who are in crisis for suicide ideation or feeling anxious and alone. All of us need that social connection. Secondly, I think many of us are feeling as though we have lost a bit of our own autonomy, our own ability to control our environment, and that kind of feels a bit deflating. A bit takes it away from us and also makes us anxious because we don't know how long this is going for. So I sort of go, regain control. You can set a routine within your own home. You can choose to do this in your own unique way. You can actually have more freedom to do that than perhaps we can when we're going to work and doing other things. So I think that psychologically that's really important. It's also really good for our health that we have a routine. Doing things like the right amount of exercise, sleeping, not too much alcohol, those kind of things I think are really important. And reaching out to others. We heard from, and I said this before, we heard from our fellow Aussies during the bushfires, that when the chips were down, we really needed to rely on each other and we needed to build community. So how we can proactively build community, we are in a digital world. We do have people in our society who don't know how to do that online stuff. How can we reach out and help them? Random acts of kindness, I think, are great. And I think the good old Aussie spirit, I don't know if you've seen it, but the bin night, dress up for bin night, those kind of things where we're reclaiming some of that creativity, some of that energy, some of that hope that as we come out of this, we can actually come out of it different, but okay.
Watching those Andrew Cashin mashups too on TikTok can help.
Sorry, two completely unrelated questions. The first one, do you realistically, in terms of getting the budget back on track on the road out, do you realistically expect to be able to take the job seeker payment back to its original level? You just said in your opening remarks 800,000 people have signed up. or would you be prepared to taper it or revert it to a higher than original level? And just the second question, we're anticipating as early as tomorrow the resignation of Mike Kelly. What relevance would you ascribe in terms of a test or whatever, the outcome of the subsequent by-election in the current circumstances?
Well, let me do with the first question. Job seeker supplement, COVID supplement, which has begun this week, and the JobKeeper arrangements were temporary measures that were put in place for the COVID period, which was set till the end of September. Our objective is to get those on JobSeeker and JobKeeper back into their jobs. That's what our objective is. That's what we're focused on. That's what our road ahead is about, is to get those Australians off those income supports and back into employment. And to do that, it means, as I started this press conference by saying, success looks like that. It looks like people getting back into their jobs, businesses reopening, Australians being able to move back into a COVID-safe world where protections are in place and maximises the amount of activity that they can undertake. Now, when you're in that situation, then obviously the income supports that have been put in place to get people through that period won't be necessary on the other side. We made that clear at the outset. This was emergency response measures. This was not a change in the government's view about the broader role of the social safety net in Australia. I think we have a very strong social safety net, but in this particular point of time, and as the Treasury Secretary pointed out yesterday, when you're looking at unemployment going above 10%, as I've said to you on a number of occasions, I fear worse statistics coming forward on the economy in the months ahead, and we need to prepare ourselves for that. That's why JobSeeker and JobKeeper were put in place to deal with the heavy blow that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to have on the Australian economy. But that's why we also need to move as quickly as we can, getting these protections in place to ensure that our economy can grow. Now, the budget will be restored by our economy growing. And that's why as we move towards the budget scheduled for October this year, then we'll be in a position to outline a range of measures that will support that growth into the future, which will support the budget. That's important because the budget supports essential services. It's all about jobs, it's all about services going forward, and ensuring that we can do that in a responsible and sustainable way with the budget. And these emergency measures come at a great cost, and clearly that level of cost is not a sustainable level beyond what we've flagged. In relation to Dr. Kelly, I wish him well if he indeed intends to make that announcement soon. He's served his country in uniform, he's served his country in the Parliament, and if that indeed is the decision he makes, I wish him all the best, and I thank him for his service in both of those respects. The Liberal Party will certainly contest the seat, as I'm sure the National Party will certainly contest the seat, but that doesn't change the history, which would mean that it'd be a 1 in 100-year event for a government in those circumstances. If they were to take a seat from the opposition, that would be a rather extraordinary outcome, but it's one we will put our best foot forward for in this environment. But my expectations, well, I think you can say are conditioned by history, and I think that would be the reasonable assessment. But that said, I mean, the government has a plan. We're showing, I think, the leadership through this crisis that Australians are seeking from the government. And importantly, we are focused on what success looks like for our country. And it's not just beating the virus. It's about ensuring that we can get Australia back to where we were and to make us even stronger beyond that. And that's what our government will always stand for, and the policies that support that. Now, just as we leave, I just want to give a reminder on this Lifeline number, Lifeline Australia, 13 11 14. Kids Helpline is 1800 55 1800. Beyondblue is 1300 224 636. The Suicide Callback Service is 1300 659 467. Men's Line Australia doing a great job, 1300 78 99 78, so that's 1300 78 99 78. And Headspace, you can access them at www.headspace.org.au. And as always, call your GP. Telehealth is available to you through your GP. And don't forget the COVID helpline, 1800 020 080. And don't forget, Download the app. Download the app. Put your sunscreen on equivalent. Download that app, and the sooner we can get Australia back to where we want it to be, we will achieve that together. Thank you all very much.